All right, our final paper of the session is from Ed Callway. He's going to speak about variable frame rate technology. Change is good. Ed Callway is a principal member of the technical staff at AMD. And at ATI AMD, he has developed a range of products, including sound and graphics cards, the award-winning all-in-wonder graphics and TV tuner series, STB DTV designs, as well as algorithms for video and display processing. His current work is focused on virtual reality and high dynamic range displays. Please welcome Ed.
Hi, and thanks for staying for the last presentation, and I'll try not to keep you too separated from your beer. My background is in PC and consumer video hardware, and that's all about giving end users enjoyable images at an enjoyable price. So a lot of the world we work in isn't perfect, and there's one of the particular things is the frame rate is often not where you want it to be. I know the industry spent well over 100 years trying to get constant frame rates and a limited number of frame rates that are standard, but in reality, there's a lot of variation and it's getting worse. So the trick is to try and deliberately allow variable frame rates and use that to our advantage and not pretend they don't exist. So where do we get variable frame rates and drop frames? The first thing is content has a lot of variable frame rates, from hand cranked film in the past through computer gaming, VR. When you start getting cameras for VR with multiple cameras, you can get a lot of frame rates right up to 120 frames per second, and they can all come into the same edit session. The standard rates that we have up there, they go really from 8 frames per second for anime up to 120 for VR, and everywhere in between. All those 1,000 over 1,001 variants creep in, and in the past there's been a lot of game consoles with their own slight variation, and when you start bringing all that content together in an edit, often you have to wait for the render, a full render, to really play it back and see, okay, what am I producing? And that can take a lot of time. So when you can't match the frame rate of your content to a frame rate that your monitor supports, something has to give. And what gives is some kind of frame rate conversion. A lot of times in the consumer world, that is drop repeat frame rate conversion. It's not some beautiful calculation. The worst example in my house is we watch a lot of British crime dramas that were originally done at 50. And by the time we get them, it's judder TV. It looks like Donald Trump explaining things. It doesn't work. And yet people watch them. So consumers have quite a high tolerance, but we'd like to be able to handle that better. So that's really the multiple content frame rates. But who's really allowing all these dropped and late frames? And that's because there's been a change in how things are created. These days, an awful lot of content that a user sees is not fully rendered at a production house. It's rendered on their phone, on their television, and their game console and their PC, because they're adding a lot of content through a game engine for VFX, for adding in commercial advertising content. And so what's happening there is the user, the real choice the user has is how much money do they spend on their hardware. Some well-aware, I don't say educated, but well-aware gaming users, they'll do things like they'll change the resolution, they'll change their render quality. Do I want a higher frame rate but lower quality pixels for professional gaming, or am I happier with a lower frame rate and better anti-aliasing because I like visually beautiful games? So there's a lot of user choice, and the content developer doesn't really know what the end user has. And so what happens is there will be dropped frames, and the content developer is not going to see them. The end users can't just go and buy a bigger server. They really have to live with what they've got. So how can we make that better? The picture at the bottom, one of these is a laser. Yes. So this picture at the bottom is a typical pipeline in a consumer product. At the left, there's somebody's streaming something in, they're decoding something from a disk, they're playing a game, they're rendering in real time, and there can be drops in frames that are late from the streaming, from the decoding. It's going through a CPU and a GPU to produce the final image. That may not always be powerful enough for either what the content vendor intended, or the user may have just, for a game specifically, may have put much higher quality parameters than their hardware can produce for every scene. So what happens is this left part of the pipeline is where problems are created. That's where frames get dropped or they get late. On the right side, you've got the monitor, and the monitor may not support the frame rate that the content was produced at. So again, the answer may be, well, let's do frame rate conversion. But if you're in a consumer product, you don't have necessarily the compute power to do a good frame rate conversion. You've also got the frames. They might be 60 all the time, and occasionally they're going to drop to 40 or 30, and then they're going to come back to 60 or higher. Frame rate conversion doesn't like being done with constantly varying frame rates. You like to set it up with 2 frame rates and do it. And you also have the latency that frame rate conversion introduces. But if you're doing a Skype call, if you're playing a game, or if you like VR without vomiting, you don't want to add extra latency. So normal frame rate conversion isn't always an available consumer choice. What you do have available is just what's in this back end of the pipe, and that's the display portion of the GPU. That's not doing any fancy compute. That's just picking rendered images from the frame buffer, throwing them to the display, and you've got the monitor, which if you start reprogramming the firmware and recalibrating it, you can do a lot of variable frame rate work. So that's the world we're working in. Slightly inadequate hardware for what people may want have intended to do. By the time you get here, it's too late to fix it. And what you've got left is, can I make the monitor synchronize to the frame rate I've got, frame by frame, so that I'm not doing drop repeat frame rate conversion? So before I go into a lot of timing diagrams, I just wanted to do a quick look at where is the market, what's the reality of this? And the reality is actually quite good. There are a lot of products available that support variable frame rates. AMD, where I'm working, has a version called FreeSync. Our very good friends at NVIDIA have a system they've had for a while called G-Sync. Both of these systems support variable frame rates to deal with these intermittent drop frames. The HDMI standard now includes variable refresh rate as part of the HDMI standard, and DisplayPort's had adaptive sync for quite a while. So there's a lot of actual products in the market, and there's standardization. They don't always come together, but we're in a pretty good place. There's many, many products shipping. There's hundreds of monitors and graphics cards, and there are PC notebooks that support variable frame rate, which may not just be for gaming people. You can also use those for things like editing, where you want to see a good playback of multiple rate content without waiting for a full render. Everybody's goals are smoother, more accurate display of content. Everybody's working to that. And I think over time, all of these 4 related and slightly different approaches will converge towards the standard. So we're in a good place. Stuff is available now. That's worth listening to the rest. So to get into how it's done, The timing is everything, and the timing actually is very, very simple. So this is a fairly simple diagram. There's a normal frame. You've got your back porch, you've got your active time where you're scanning out, and your nominal front porch. If something's going to be late, all you end up doing is extending the front porch until the next frame is ready. And it sounds really easy, and that part of it is. The difficulty is the details. In the past, if you tried this with an older, like a CRT, the screen would go black, all kinds of relays would click, and about 5 seconds later, you'd get your picture back. With LCD monitors, you don't hear the relays clicking, but the effect is the same. You change a timing parameter, and your screen goes black. With variable refresh rate technologies, what happens is, the key is you really keep the clocking the same, you keep the horizontal parameters the same, and you're really just adding and dropping vertical lines. And this makes it very easy for the graphics controller that's sending it out to just say, I'm going to extend the time a little longer before I send a VSync. And it makes it fairly easy for the monitor to say, I'm just going to wait here, hold the current frame until there is a new VSync. And so the basic idea is very simple. This diagram is vaguely similar to the way HDMI does it. This is the very similar way that DisplayPort does it. They're a little more digital, so what happens in DisplayPort is normally the vertical timing is fixed, and it's stuck in a little, that is the wrong button, that was me. There we go. And that's in this little mainstream attribute packet that says this is what the timing is supposed to be. If you want to go put a DisplayPort system into a variable timing mode, all you do is you send a packet to the monitor and you tell it, you know what, ignore the mainstream attribute and just look at the blank start and blank end, and that'll tell you where your frame is. And so again, all that happens is the display controller in the GPU says, this frame is late, just hang it, keep the current frame displayed, and then wait for the next one. So again, the basic technology is pretty simple. The details are always unpleasant. This is a series of diagrams that kind of show where that motion judder comes from when you start dropping frames and how this fixes it. So this is a simple scenario where nothing's being dropped, everything's perfect. Down the middle, there's a 60 hertz timeline, for example. We're just showing display time and blank time. If frame 1's being displayed, frame 2's ready. At the end of blank, you start displaying it. Frame 3 ended up a little early, so you just wait. You display it on time. Everybody's happy. This is normal. And if you're eye tracking this motion, your eyes are going to track kind of along this gray line. And if you've seen a couple of frames where this motorcycle's moving, eventually your eye locks into that. And in an ideal world, as your eyes move along, the motorcycle appears where you expect it. So this is when everything's happy. When you start getting late frames, again, due to variable rate content or frames getting dropped or the streamer being late, it can get ugly very, very quickly, because what happens is, even if you're displaying frame 1, your eyes tracking it, if that frame is only 1 millisecond late, typically the display controller has no choice but to repeat frame 1. And all of a sudden, you're down to effectively a 30 frame per second rate. Frame 3 can come along, it's displayed, but what happened here in the eye tracking is you're way out. Your eye is looking for somewhere 16 milliseconds where it isn't. And so that gets you that severe motion judder unless you do something. The other one trick that some of the gamers use is they decouple the flipping of frames and the presenting of frames from the VSync. And so what they'll do is, frame 1 appears, frame 2 is late, so they start repeating frame 1, and then as soon as frame 2 is ready, the display controller just mid-frame switches to the frame 2 content. So the good news for competitive gamers is, yeah, they get some reduced latency, they see that thing as soon as it's available, but for normal video, it's pretty hideous because you do get that tearing. So this is a gaming, a low-cost, well, a free gaming solution that's been used for years, but it's not really suitable for anything else. As soon as you start allowing the V-blank to extend flexibly, it gets a lot better. In this case, that frame is still 1 millisecond late. It's displayed 1 millisecond late. And if you look what happens on this reasonably accurately drawn eye tracking timeline, you're out by about half a head width because you've only displaced the frame by about a millisecond. You haven't lost that full 16 milliseconds. Frame 3 comes in on time. You shorten up that V-blank, and you can do that by clocking things out a little faster than you normally would. And so with some very simple methods, you can reduce that motion judder that you'd normally get from a very short time delay. Some of the neat things that the game engines can do, though, is in this case, I'm going to have 2 frames that are late. So the first one, you still get that little bit of tracking error. But what the game engines can do, and they do this for a lot of other reasons, is if a game engine sees that a scene is difficult to render and maybe you're dropping to 40, 50 frames a second, the game engine will say, well, I know I'm late, I know I'm in this scene, I'm just going to adjust my physics timelines to, I'm going to render knowing it's going to be presented, say, at 40 or 50 hertz. And as soon as you do that with variable frame rates, it gets really nice because this frame was late, there's a little bit of judder, this frame's late too, but it was rendered now with that motorcycle pushed a little farther over, knowing it was going to be late, and that eye tracking starts to line up really, really well. These are highly simplified, highly optimistic views of everything, but I wanted to get the ideas across as simply as possible. So the next, that's really how the timing works. The next best thing, the next topic is what happens inside the display. What does the display vendor have to do? And it's not that bad. So I'm going to be talking about LCD displays because they are the most common, but there's no reason that variable frame technology can't be used with other displays, such as OLED. As I think everybody knows, despite marketing claims to the contrary, LCD panels are pretty slow to switch from one pixel level to another. So what gets used all the time is a technique called overdrive, where when you have this light change that you want, if you don't do anything, you get this very slow light change. So you apply some overdrive and you boost it on the way up and you undershoot on the way down. And so overall you can get this much better response curve. And that's how, you know, gaming monitors say, yes, we have a 1 millisecond response. They don't really, but they kind of do. What happens when you're building a normal monitor, and your normal monitor may support 10 different refresh rates, they'll just calibrate those overdrive tables for those 10 rates that they support. They'll report those rates back in the EDID and everybody's happy. But if you're building a variable refresh rate monitor, what you have to do is you, as the monitor vendor, have to go to the panel vendor and first of all say, you know, I'd like a panel that I can use from 30 to 144. And the panel vendor in the past would say, we've never tested that. Now the panel vendors do test that, but the monitor vendor still has to do the work of testing and calibrating things like gamma, overshoot, ghosting, viewing angle. All these things can change in an LCD monitor as you change that refresh rate. So the panel vendor has this extra calibration work to do. Other than the calibration, there shouldn't be a lot of hardware work required in the monitor. This is the inside of a very typical monitor. There's HDMI and DisplayPort connectors at the top. Under the heatsink, there's a little scalar controller chip. And at the bottom, there's the connections out to the actual raw panel. Those little scalar controllers are actually fairly powerful. They have a micro, they have a lot of counter timers. They do all the lookup work for the overdrive. They have a little bit of a frame buffer for that. What it turns out is for this, these very simple methods of just delaying the V-blank, most of these scalar controller chips do support things like FreeSync with essentially just firmware changes because they have enough compute power to recognize a frame is late, I'm going to hold it. So the good news is you don't really need to do a lot of hardware changes other than in a monitor, other than make sure your panel is specified and tested for wide range use, and then you have to do the work to put in the extra compensation tables and maybe interpolate between tables. This is sort of an extended view. If you look at a monitor that can maybe run down to 35 hertz, so you can lock the monitor to the display at rate safe, and for a particular panel anywhere from 35 to 150. What happens if the frame rate drops to 20 or 25? You'd still like to give some benefit, because what happens is, as an example, if you look at without some extra low frame rate compensation, in this case, say between 90 and 35, you've got a perfect lock with no motion. Down in this region, you have to start dropping, repeating again, so you're back as if you did nothing. And so you start getting some V-sync, some missed V-sync judder in this region. Once you're down around 10, 15 frames per second, you've got so much source judder, it really doesn't matter. What you can do is, when you start seeing yourself in this range below the panel, you can adaptively insert extra frames that are synchronized. And so you can extend the effective range of smooth motion really right down to the point where there's so much judder from just being a low frame rate, there's no hope when you're into anime or Hanna-Barbera cartoons. Again, fairly simple diagrams. In the center, there's some source frames coming at you at 26 frames per second. If your monitor just can stick at 35, that's as low as it goes. You end up with repeating a few, and you end up with these large timing errors. For low frame rate compensation, in this particular case, you just take those 26, you measure that, you see what's happening, you start sending out the same frame twice, but you send it out at 52. So it stays synchronized, it appears as one frame to you. The LCD panel sees 2 frames, so it's happy with its timing. And so this is just a technique to extend that range right down as low as possible, below what the panel normally supports. Little bit extra stuff you can start doing. Once the monitors and the graphics cards start talking like this and saying, what can you do, what can I do, what can I do better? If you look at what happens with HDR gaming, typically the game will render in some fairly large HDR space in linear light. The game will then have to tone map down to the transport layer, which would say typically be something like HDR10. But what would happen is HDR10 is still a huge range, and then the monitor will end up always with a smaller range. It'll remap again. So you're going to lose some bit precision, maybe get some contouring, maybe add some delay. Once we start doing these things where the monitor and the graphics card are talking, what happens with FreeSync HDR is we get the monitor to send back right to this mapping stage. Hey, this is all I can do, so we can get the game to just tone map once, not to say a big HDR10 range, but to the much smaller range that the monitor supports. So that preserves a little bit better the artistic intent. And it's nice for us and for you to have some kind of growth path where features can keep getting added. And we do that when we can together with the standards bodies when they become available. Variable frame rate stuff, basically it's cheap, it's useful, it works, and it's available now. It's been available for several years. Start thinking about uses outside this sort of gaming PC world. You can do things like get monitors to sync to variable frame rates in an edit stream without doing explicit frame rate compensation conversion. You don't have to buy, for consumer products, you don't have to either downgrade your content or upgrade your hardware to handle the absolute worst case to guarantee no drop frames. You can start doing things where you say, well, you know, if I get 5% drop frames occasionally, a bit lower frame rate, that's overall a much better place to be in for overall better quality, and then having the monitor locked to those lower frames with minimal effects allows me to get a better product at a lower price. This stuff was all previously only in the PC world. It's now in game consoles, televisions, and we're certainly looking at extending it into more professional applications. That's it.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please tap the like button and also subscribe to our channel to receive notifications when we add new content. For more information about us, please visit SMPTE.org. We'll see you next time.